I'd like to think my life was as stable as it gets. I'm Andrew, 38 years old, a hardworking entrepreneur who built a small tech business from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it put food on the table. I wasn't born into wealth, but I'd made enough to live comfortably alongside my wife, Laura. I thought we were happy, though hindsight now makes me wonder if I was ever paying enough attention. Laura. She's the kind of woman who knows how to turn heads when she walks into a room. Stylish, charming, with this effortless ability to command attention wherever she went. She'd always had big dreams, a life full of luxury, traveling the world, the kind of things money buys. And while I couldn't always match her vision, I worked hard to keep her content. We had been married for 8 years, and while we didn't have children, it didn't feel like a gap in our lives at the time. We filled our days with plans, projects, and the occasional vacation. Laura was always a social butterfly, hopping from one brunch to another, while I focused on building our future. Things took a drastic turn when my parents passed away. First, it was my father, sudden and unexpected. His passing hit hard, but it wasn't until 6 months later, when my mother followed after a long illness, that I felt the ground shift beneath me. Losing both of them in less than a year. It was devastating. But amidst the grief, something positive came out of it. An inheritance. My parents had worked tirelessly their entire lives, and the fruits of their labor were now passed down to me. It was a significant amount, $5 million to be exact. My mother had always emphasized the importance of preserving our family home, ensuring it stayed a symbol of our legacy. It wasn't just a house. It was a lifetime of memories, values, and love. From the moment the inheritance was mentioned, Laura's interest shifted. It wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. She started asking subtle questions about what we'd do with the money. I'd respond with things like, "First, I want to make sure the house is maintained. Maybe some renovations." She'd smile and nod, but her eyes told me she had other plans. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't expect her to be indifferent. Who wouldn't be intrigued by a sudden windfall? But the way she started pushing certain ideas was a red flag I chose to ignore. "Why don't we sell the house and use the money for something practical?" she'd ask. I'd explain that it wasn't about practicality. It was about honoring my parents. Those conversations were always lighthearted, but left me unsettled. I had no idea how deep her dissatisfaction with our life had grown. If I'd known, maybe I would have seen what was coming. Maybe I would have prepared myself for what she was capable of. At the time, though, I believed everything was fine. My focus was on grieving and making plans to ensure my parents' memory was preserved. Laura, to her credit, offered support during the immediate aftermath. She attended both funerals, consoled me, and even took on a few responsibilities around the house. I thought we were on the same page. But grief has a funny way of blinding you to the truth. Looking back now, I wonder how I missed the signs. The subtle annoyance in her voice when I mentioned long-term plans for the inheritance. The way she avoided joining me when I visited my parents' house to tidy up and organize their belongings. I assumed she was giving me space, but in reality, she was stepping further away from me and closer to her own agenda. That inheritance wasn't just money to me. It was a piece of my parents' legacy, a testament to their hard work and the life they built. The house, especially, held memories that couldn't be replaced. I wanted to protect it, to keep it as a symbol of everything they stood for. If only I'd realized sooner that Laura didn't share those values. For her, the inheritance wasn't a legacy. It was an opportunity. And when she saw that I wouldn't hand it over easily, she decided to take matters into her own hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At that point in time, I thought my life was stable. I thought Laura and I were on the same team. I thought the worst was behind me after losing my parents. Little did I know, the storm was just beginning. I was halfway through a business trip when the phone rang. It was Laura, her name lighting up my screen. I remember smiling to myself, thinking she'd probably call to check in, maybe ask if I was eating enough, or remind me to rest. She had her moments of care, even if they were becoming fewer lately. But the moment I picked up, her voice cut through any illusion of normalcy. "Andrew, we need to talk about the inheritance," she said without preamble. I blinked, taken aback. The inheritance? "Laura, I thought we already discussed this." The money is for preserving my parents' legacy. She sighed loudly, a sound so exaggerated I could picture her rolling her eyes. Andrew, come on. You don't need to hold on to all of that. You're being sentimental. Sentimental? That's what she called it. The thought of selling the house, the place where I grew up, where my parents poured their love and energy, was unthinkable to me. I tried to stay calm. Laura, we've talked about this. The house isn't just a building. It's… Yeah, she interrupted. It's their legacy. It's sacred, whatever. But do you know what we could do with $5 million? We could build our dream home, travel, invest. You're clinging to something that's not practical. Her tone grated on me. This wasn't a conversation. It was a negotiation, and I was the stubborn client refusing to sign the dotted line. Laura, I told you, that money isn't up for debate. It's staying in the trust. She scoffed. A trust? For what? To sit there and collect dust while you play guardian of your parents' memories? Andrew, this is our chance to live the life we've always talked about. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. No, Laura. This money isn't for us to splurge. It's for preserving the house and ensuring my parents' legacy is intact. Her response was immediate, sharp. So you're saying no? Yes, I'm saying no. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, the faint hum of background noise on her end. Then she spoke, her voice low and cold. You know, I've supported you through a lot. I've been patient, but maybe I've been too patient. You're putting dead people over your living wife. I clenched my jaw. That's not fair, Laura. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about doing what's right. What's right for who, Andrew? You? Your dead parents? What about what's right for me? Her words stung, but I kept my composure. Laura, I've made my decision. This isn't up for discussion. Fine, she said after a beat. Have it your way. And then she hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. The call had ended, but the unease lingered. This wasn't the first time we'd argued about the inheritance, but something about her tone this time felt different. There was a finality to it, a sharp edge that made my stomach twist. Still, I shook it off. Maybe she just needed time to cool down. Maybe she'd come to understand why this was so important to me. Or maybe I was fooling myself, pretending everything would be okay when deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, as I lay in my hotel bed, I replayed the conversation in my head. Her words kept circling back, louder each time. You're putting dead people over your living wife. It wasn't just the words that bothered me. It was the implication. The accusation that I was failing her somehow, that I wasn't doing enough. But how could she not see? How could she not understand that this wasn't about money or priorities? It was about respect, about honoring the people who raised me, who sacrificed so much so I could have a better life. I told myself I'd address it when I got home. Maybe if I explained it again, more clearly this time, she'd come around. She'd see reason. She had to. But Laura had no intention of coming around. While I was busy justifying my actions, she was already putting her plan into motion. And by the time I realized it, it was far too late. I was in the middle of a conference call when my phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen. Laura. Again. She'd been unusually persistent lately, but I ignored it, muting the ringer and focusing on the discussion. The call ended an hour later, and I saw 3 missed calls and a text. Call me now. I sighed, already bracing myself. When I called her back, the venom in her voice hit me like a slap. Andrew, she began, her words sharp and deliberate. I've done something you're going to thank me for eventually. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice steady but wary. There was a pause, a cruel kind of suspense, before she delivered the blow. I demolished your parents' house. For a moment, I thought I misheard her. You what? You heard me, she said smugly. The house is gone. Flattened. It was a waste of space, Andrew, and I made an executive decision. My head spun. Are you out of your mind? Laura, that was my parents' home. What gives you the right? What gives me the right? She interrupted, her voice rising. I'm your wife. Or did you forget that in your little shrine to your dead parents? That house was standing in the way of our future, Andrew, so I took care of it. You had no right. I snapped, pacing the room. That house was part of their legacy. It wasn't yours to destroy. Legacy? She scoffed. What legacy, Andrew? It was an old, empty house that you couldn't let go of. I did you a favor. My mind raced. What about my parents' belongings? Their furniture, their photos? Relax, she said dismissively. I kept a few things. The rest, well, let's just say I cleaned up for you. I was speechless. Rage bubbled in my chest, but before I could respond, she dropped another bombshell. Oh, and one more thing, she added, her tone dripping with malice. My boyfriend and I are moving onto the property. We're building our dream home. You're what? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My boyfriend, she repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You didn't really think I'd stick around while you clung to your parents' ghost stories, did you? He understands me. He supports me. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. And what about my parents? Where are they supposed to live now? She let out a mocking laugh. Oh, don't worry. I arranged for them to move into an old-age home. They'll be fine. Honestly, I don't know why you're so worked up about this. You should be thanking me. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Thanking you, I said, my voice low and cold. You think I'm going to thank you for betraying me? For destroying my family's home and throwing my parents into a care facility like they're disposable? You're being dramatic, she said, unfazed. It's done, Andrew. Accept it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Every word out of her mouth fueled the fire in me. I hung up without saying another word, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a response. My hands were shaking as I packed my bags and booked the earliest flight home. The entire trip back, I replayed the conversation in my head, each detail more unbelievable than the last. The house gone. My parents, discarded. Laura, shamelessly flaunting her affair. How had it come to this? How had the woman I trusted with my life turned into someone I'd barely recognized? By the time I landed, I wasn't just angry, I was determined. Whatever Laura thought she had won, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. She thought she'd beaten me, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. When I pulled up to what used to be my parents' house, the sight of the rubble nearly brought me to my knees. Everything was gone. The house where I grew up, where every memory of my parents was rooted, was now just a pile of debris. And there she was, standing amid the destruction, smiling as if she'd accomplished something remarkable. Beside her stood a man I assumed was the infamous boyfriend. They both looked so smug, so satisfied, as if they'd just conquered the world. But their smiles didn't last long, because the moment Laura saw the look in my eyes, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive from the airport to what used to be my parents' home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every breath I took felt like it was feeding a fire inside me, but I told myself to stay calm. I needed to see it for myself, to look Laura in the eye and hear her justify the unjustifiable. As I turned onto the familiar street, my heart sank. Where the home I grew up in once proudly stood, there was nothing but a heap of rubble. The driveway, once lined with blooming flowers my mother had planted, was littered with debris. The old oak tree in the yard was gone, replaced by a few stakes marking the foundation of whatever monstrosity Laura had planned to build. And there she was, standing in the middle of it all, wearing a bright red dress and a smirk that made my blood boil. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize but didn't need to. His body language said everything. Arms crossed, head tilted slightly, a smugness that mirrored hers perfectly. I parked and stepped out of the car, my gaze fixed on her. Laura noticed me immediately, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. But she quickly masked it with that infuriating smile. Well, look who's back, she said, her tone dripping with mockery. Did you cut your trip short just to see my handiwork? I ignored her and surveyed the scene. The house was completely gone. The fence my dad and I had fixed up the summer before I left for college was in pieces. The garden where my mom used to spend her mornings was a mound of dirt. It was like someone had erased a part of my life. Why? I asked finally, my voice low but steady. Why would you do this? Laura tilted her head, pretending to think. Because it needed to be done. That house was an eyesore, Andrew. It was old, falling apart, full of memories that you refused to let go of. Now we can build something better, something new? We? I asked, my eyes narrowing. You mean you and him? I gestured to the man standing beside her. The man stepped forward, extending a hand. Name's David, he said, as if we were meeting at a dinner party. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I turned back to Laura. You think this is a game? I asked, my voice rising. That house wasn't just a building. It was my parents' home. It was their legacy. Legacy, legacy, Laura said, waving her hand dismissively. You're obsessed with the past, Andrew. It's time to move forward. And let's be honest, you weren't going to do it on your own, so I took the initiative. You took the initiative? I repeated, disbelief mingling with anger. You had no right. That house wasn't yours to touch. She crossed her arms, her smirk returning. Actually, it was. As your wife, I have just as much a claim on this property as you do. Besides, it's not like your parents need it anymore. They're perfectly fine where they are now. I clenched my fists. And where exactly are they, Laura? Where did you put my parents? Her smile widened. In a nice little care facility. They'll be taken care of, probably better than they ever were in that dusty old house. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. You threw my parents into a care home without even consulting me? Oh, please, she said with a laugh. You would have dragged your feet and come up with some emotional excuse to keep them in the house. I made the hard decision for you. The audacity of her words left me speechless. She wasn't just unapologetic. She was proud. She genuinely believed she'd done me a favor. I glanced at David, who was leaning against the remains of a wall, looking utterly unconcerned. Are you really okay with this? I asked him. You're standing here, watching her destroy my life, and you're fine with it? David shrugged. Laura told me everything. It's not like you're the victim here, man. She just wanted a better life. Can you blame her? That was the breaking point. I took a step toward him, but Laura stepped between us, holding up a hand. Don't even think about it, Andrew. This isn't the time or place for macho posturing. I exhaled sharply, stepping back. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with anger. I wanted to yell, to scream, to make them understand what they'd done, but I knew it would fall on deaf ears. Instead, I smiled, a cold, humorless smile that wiped the smirk off Laura's face. You think you've won, don't you? I said. You think you've destroyed everything I care about and can just walk away. Laura hesitated. What are you talking about? You'll find out soon enough, I said, my voice calm but filled with resolve. Enjoy your little victory while it lasts, Laura. Because this isn't over. I turned and walked back to my car, ignoring her calls to stop. As I drove away, my mind was already racing, piecing together what I needed to do next. Laura thought she had taken everything from me, but she underestimated one crucial thing. Me. Driving away from the wreckage of my parents' home, my mind was clear for the first time in days. Laura thought she'd backed me into a corner, that her betrayal was the end of the story. She couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't about to let her walk away from this unscathed. When I got home, I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the dining table, and began sorting through everything I'd need to undo the damage. The first step was simple: legal action. Laura's smug belief that she had equal claim to the house was laughable. She had no idea that the inheritance, including the property, was placed in a trust specifically to protect it from situations like this. The next morning, I made an appointment with my lawyer, Mr. Collins. A sharp man in his 50s with a reputation for leaving no stone unturned, he listened intently as I laid out the situation. She demolished the house without my consent, forged documents to authorize the demolition, and threw my parents into a care facility against their wishes. I explained, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and determination. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Do you have proof of the forgery and the demolition? Yes, I said. I've got emails, texts, and records from the demolition company. He nodded. Good. That's more than enough to establish a case. I'll draft a formal complaint and notify her immediately. You'll also want to secure the care facility records for your parents. By the end of the meeting, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Laura may have thought she'd won, but the wheels of justice were now in motion. The second phase of my plan was a little more personal. Laura's arrogance had given me the advantage. She wasn't just careless, she was overconfident, which meant she left a trail. I spent the next 2 days combing through bank statements, phone records, and social media posts. Sure enough, I found what I was looking for: evidence of her affair. Text messages, shared photos, even receipts for gifts she'd bought for her boyfriend, David, using my money. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront them both. I wasn't interested in yelling or making a scene. No, this needed to be calculated, precise. I wanted them to feel the consequences of their actions in real time. 2 days later, I found myself standing in front of David's workplace. It was a mid-level corporate office in a nondescript building downtown. I'd arranged to meet him during his lunch break. As he walked out, his eyes widened when he saw me. "Andrew," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone steady. "It won't take long." He looked nervous but nodded, gesturing toward a bench outside. As we sat, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder containing the evidence. "David, I'm going to make this very simple," I began. "I know about you and Laura. I know about the gifts, the messages, everything." He paled. "Look, man, it's not what you think." "Save it," I interrupted. "This isn't a negotiation. I don't care about your excuses. What I care about is what happens next." David swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" I said, leaning closer. "If you don't want this to blow up in your face, at work, with your family, everywhere, you're going to walk away. From Laura. From everything." His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "You can't just—" "I can," I said firmly. "And I will. Unless you want me to forward these messages to your boss or anyone else who matters in your life, you'll end things with Laura today. Am I clear?" He nodded, visibly shaken. Fine. I'll end it." "Good," I said, standing up. "And don't think for a second that I won't follow through if you step out of line." Next, it was Laura's turn. That evening, I returned to the house site with Mr. Collins, who had arranged for a legal notice to be delivered in person. Laura was there, pacing near the rubble, her phone in hand. When she saw me, her face lit up with a mixture of annoyance and fake bravado. "Back so soon," she said. "I thought you'd given up." "Not even close," I replied, handing her the envelope. "This is for you." She frowned, opening the envelope and scanning the document inside. Her expression shifted from confusion to panic as she read. "What is this?" she demanded. "It's a formal complaint," I said calmly. "You destroyed property that didn't belong to you, forged documents, and used my money without consent. You're going to be held accountable." "You can't be serious," she scoffed. "You're really going to sue your own wife?" "You stopped being my wife the moment you betrayed me," I said coldly. "From now on, this is strictly business." Laura's confidence wavered, but she tried to recover. "You think you're so smart, don't you? This won't hold up in court." "Maybe not," I said with a shrug. "But the evidence says otherwise. Oh, and by the way, David's out. He dumped you. Thought you should know." Her eyes widened in shock. What did you do?" "Don't worry about it," I said, turning to leave. "Worry about yourself." As I walked away, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. Laura thought she'd won, but the game had only just begun, and I was determined to finish it. I wasn't expecting Laura to go down without a fight, but her next move was as predictable as it was pathetic. She showed up at my office 2 days later, unannounced, her face a mixture of forced charm and simmering frustration. I hadn't seen her look this rattled in years, and frankly, I enjoyed watching her squirm. "Andrew," she said, stepping into my office without so much as a knock. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, feigning indifference. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said." "Don't be like this," she snapped. her charm slipping for just a moment before she plastered on a fake smile. This is ridiculous. You can't honestly believe I deserve to be treated like this. I raised an eyebrow. Treated like what? Someone facing the consequences of their actions? Her jaw tightened. You're overreacting. This lawsuit? It's petty and vindictive. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Laura, you demolished my parents' home without my consent, forged documents, and used my money to fund your affair. If you think this is overreacting, you have a warped sense of reality. Her face flushed red. For a moment, she looked like she might explode, but instead, she took a deep breath and softened her tone. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I made some mistakes, but we can fix this. You don't have to ruin my life over it. I let out a humorless laugh. Fix this? You didn't seem interested in fixing anything when you were flaunting your new boyfriend and destroying my family's legacy. Why the change of heart now? She hesitated, and I could see the gears turning in her head. She was trying to decide whether to play the victim or double down on her arrogance. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't in the mood for either. Before she could respond, my assistant knocked on the door and entered with perfect timing. Mr. Collins is here, she said. Send him in, I replied. Laura's eyes widened as my lawyer stepped into the room. She recognized him instantly, and her confidence faltered. Laura, Mr. Collins said politely but firmly. I trust you've had time to review the legal notice. I have, she said, her voice sharper now. And it's absurd. Andrew has no grounds to sue me. Collins adjusted his glasses and pulled out a folder. On the contrary, Mrs. Peterson, the evidence is overwhelming. The demolition of the property was unauthorized and fraudulent, as were the financial transactions used to facilitate it. These are serious charges, and if you don't settle, you'll be facing significant legal consequences. Her bravado crumbled further. Settle? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, he said, sliding the settlement offer across the desk. Restitution for the property, repayment of misused funds, and an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Sign this, and we can avoid further litigation. Laura scanned the document, her hands shaking. This is ridiculous, she muttered, but she didn't sound convinced. I leaned back in my chair, watching her struggle. Take your time, Laura. You have until the end of the day to decide. But know this, if you don't sign, this goes public. Everyone will know what you did. Your friends, your family, even your precious David. Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. You wouldn't. Try me, I said coldly. You thought you could humiliate me and get away with it. Now it's your turn. I didn't expect her to sign right then and there, but by the end of the day, my lawyer called to inform me she had. The settlement was a small victory, but it wasn't the end. I wanted everyone to know who Laura really was, not out of spite, but because people like her thrive in the shadows, hiding their true nature. The following week, word spread through our social circles. I didn't have to do much. Laura's actions spoke for themselves. Friends and acquaintances who once admired her began to distance themselves. Her name became synonymous with betrayal and deceit. Even her boyfriend, David, didn't stick around. True to his cowardly nature, he disappeared as soon as the heat turned up. I didn't revel in her downfall, but I won't lie. It felt good to see her face the consequences. For years, I'd overlooked her selfishness, her entitlement, her endless need for validation. This time, she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of it. Laura, stripped of her reputation and her support system, was left with nothing. She had no job, no boyfriend, and no access to the funds she once thought she'd stolen from me. Meanwhile, I had reclaimed control of my life and my family's legacy. In the end, justice was served, but it wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for what mattered, about refusing to let someone take advantage of my kindness and loyalty. Laura had underestimated me, and that was her greatest mistake. Watching Laura's downfall felt like closure, but there was still one glaring wound that needed healing: the house. My parents' home wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a piece of them, a monument to their hard work and the memories we'd built there. Seeing it reduced to rubble every time I drove by was a constant reminder of Laura's betrayal. But where she saw an ending, I saw an opportunity to rebuild. The settlement money Laura was forced to pay, combined with the untouched inheritance, gave me the resources I needed to restore what had been lost. But I didn't just want to rebuild the house as it was. I wanted to honor my parents in a way that reflected their values, their legacy, and the love they poured into our family. I began by hiring an architect, someone who specialized in preserving the spirit of historic homes while modernizing them. Together, we went over old photographs, layouts, and even my mother's handwritten notes about the garden she dreamed of expanding one day. Every detail mattered, from the exact shade of blue on the shutters to the placement of the oak tree my father had planted in the yard. The construction process wasn't just about physical labor. It was deeply emotional. I visited the site almost daily, talking to the crew, sharing stories about my parents, and ensuring that every decision honored their memory. The workers seemed to sense how personal this project was for me, and they treated the job with care and respect. One day, as I stood in what would become the living room, I closed my eyes and imagined my parents there. My mom sitting on the couch with a book, my dad tinkering with something at his workbench. For a moment, I could almost hear their laughter, feel their presence. It was bittersweet, but it gave me the strength to keep going. As the house began to take shape, I realized it wasn't just about rebuilding a structure. It was about reclaiming what Laura had tried to take from me. My connection to my past, my sense of stability, and my identity. Every nail driven into the wood, every wall painted, every flower planted in the garden felt like a small victory. I didn't do it alone. My parents' legacy wasn't just about me. It was about our family. My son, Eric, took a particular interest in the project, offering ideas and even rolling up his sleeves to help. He wasn't just my son. He was my parents' grandson, and seeing him so invested reminded me of the generational bond we were preserving. "Dad," he said one afternoon as we planted a row of daisies in the garden, "Grandma would have loved this." "She would have," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat, "and she'd have loved seeing you here, helping out." Eric smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The day the house was finished was one of the most emotional days of my life. Standing there, looking at the completed home, I felt a surge of pride and gratitude. It wasn't exactly the same as the house I grew up in. It was better. It was a perfect blend of the past and the future, a place where old memories could coexist with new beginnings. I hosted a small gathering to celebrate. It wasn't a party, more of a quiet tribute. Close friends, family, and a few of my parents' old neighbors came to see the house. As I gave them a tour, sharing stories about my parents and explaining the thought behind each detail, I realized just how much this project had healed me. But the highlight of the day was seeing my parents' reaction. I'd moved them from the care facility Laura had shoved them into and placed them in a comfortable assisted living home nearby. When they stepped into the rebuilt house, their faces lit up with recognition and joy. This feels like home," my mom said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It is home," I replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Welcome back." My dad, ever the stoic one, nodded and said, "You did good, son. Your mother and I couldn't be prouder." Hearing those words was all the validation I needed. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right decision, not just in rebuilding the house, but in standing up for myself and my family's legacy. Rebuilding the house wasn't just about fixing what Laura destroyed. It was about reclaiming my identity, honoring my parents, and proving to myself that no betrayal could take away what truly mattered. The house stood as a testament to resilience, love, and the strength to move forward. Laura's fall was as inevitable as the sunrise, though watching it unfold was something I hadn't anticipated would be so satisfying. It wasn't that I wished for her suffering. No, that wasn't it. I simply believed that justice had a way of leveling things, of balancing the scales. And in Laura's case, those scales tipped swiftly and mercilessly. It started shortly after the settlement was finalized. The social circles she once reveled in began to shrink. Her friends, who were quick to laugh at her jokes and clink glasses with her at brunches, suddenly grew distant. Word of her betrayal and the lawsuit had spread like wildfire, and as is often the case, people sided with the wronged party. I heard about it through whispers at first. A friend of mine mentioned running into someone from Laura's old circle who described her as radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had so brazenly torn apart her own marriage for personal gain. It wasn't just the betrayal that turned people away. It was the arrogance with which she had carried it out. Then came the financial fallout. The money she was forced to pay through the settlement wasn't small, and without my income to rely on, she struggled to keep up her lifestyle. She had to sell her car first, then move out of the apartment she had rented for herself and David. An apartment she could no longer afford now that David had vanished without so much as a goodbye. I'll admit, I took some satisfaction in hearing about that. David, the man who stood by her side while she tore my life apart, had disappeared as soon as her resources dried up. She hadn't just lost a boyfriend. She'd lost the validation she craved, the image of herself as desirable and in control. I encountered her by chance one day at the grocery store. She was standing in the canned goods aisle, wearing sunglasses despite being indoors. At first, I wasn't sure it was her. Her usual polished demeanor was absent, replaced by a hurried, almost nervous air. But as I approached, she froze, clearly recognizing me. "Andrew," she said, her voice hesitant, almost pleading. "Laura," I replied coolly. "It's been a while." She fidgeted with the strap of her bag, avoiding my gaze. I didn't expect to see you here." "Why not?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I still live in the same neighborhood." "I thought you moved?" Her face flushed, and she looked away. "I did. Things have just been complicated." I didn't push her for details. I didn't need to. The once confident woman who had torn through my life with reckless abandon now looked like a shadow of her former self. Not long after, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that Laura had moved back in with her parents. Her lavish lifestyle had been reduced to relying on the generosity of her family, who weren't particularly pleased with the circumstances. Her mother, a woman I'd always found cold and dismissive, was now the one offering Laura the very same critiques she had once aimed at me. "Poor planning," she reportedly said. "You should have known better." It wasn't just her finances or reputation that crumbled. It was her sense of control. Laura thrived on being the center of attention, the one calling the shots. Now, she was reduced to living under her parents' roof, enduring their judgment while trying to piece together some semblance of a new life. What struck me most, though, was how much she seemed to regret underestimating me. I received a letter from her about 6 months after the lawsuit was settled. It was handwritten, pages long, and filled with attempts at apologies. "Andrew," it began, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I was wrong. About everything. I let my greed and selfishness ruin something that should have lasted a lifetime. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly, deeply sorry." I read the letter twice, then set it down. The words felt hollow. Maybe she meant them, or maybe they were just another attempt to claw her way back into a better situation. Either way, it didn't matter. She was no longer my concern. Her fall from grace was complete, and I had no intention of helping her back up. What I found most surprising about Laura's downfall wasn't how quickly it happened, but how little I cared by the end of it. I thought I'd feel vindicated, maybe even triumphant, but what I really felt was relief. She no longer had power over me, no longer occupied space in my life or my mind. Her name became just another story I told, a cautionary tale about betrayal and greed. And as for me, I moved forward, stronger and wiser. Laura had tried to destroy me, but in the end, she only destroyed herself. It took time to rebuild, not just my parents' home, but myself. Laura's betrayal had cut deep, leaving scars I didn't fully recognize until the dust settled. But scars don't just remind you of pain. They remind you of survival. And that's exactly what I did. I survived. After everything, I focused on what mattered most. My family. My son, Eric, and daughter, Judy, became the anchors in my life, pulling me back to what was truly important. Eric's engagement was the light at the end of a dark tunnel, a chance for new beginnings not just for him, but for all of us. When Eric and his fiancée, Claire, invited me to live with them, I hesitated at first. "Dad," Eric had said, "we have the space, and we want you to be part of our lives." You've done so much for us. It's our turn to take care of you. Claire chimed in, her smile warm and genuine. We'd love to have you. Besides, you can help us settle into the new house. Their kindness was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about them offering me a place to live. It was about belonging, about moving forward as a family. I agreed, and together we planned the next chapter. Moving into Eric and Claire's new home was an adjustment, but it felt right. They had built their house on the land where my parents' home once stood, a poetic nod to the past while embracing the future. The house was modern and open, yet somehow still managed to feel like home, thanks to little touches that echoed the family's legacy. The oak tree my father planted now stood tall in the yard, its branches stretching toward the sky. I quickly found my role in this new setup. I helped Eric with the garden, sharing tips my mother had taught me, and Claire often asked me to share stories about the family, eager to learn more about the people who shaped her future husband. It was healing in ways I didn't expect, a chance to honor the past without being trapped in it. Judy visited often, bringing her warmth and energy into the house. "It's so nice seeing you like this, Dad," she said one afternoon as we cooked dinner together. "You seem lighter." "I feel lighter," I admitted. "I think I've finally let go of the weight Laura left behind." Judy nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "She didn't deserve you, Dad. But you deserve this, a fresh start." Her words stayed with me. For so long, I'd carried the anger and betrayal like a badge, letting it define me. But here, surrounded by family, I realized it was time to let it go. Laura was a chapter of my life, but not the whole story. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself smiling more, laughing more. Eric and Claire's wedding was just around the corner, and the house buzzed with excitement. I helped Eric pick out his suit, gave him advice he pretended not to need, and even learned a few dance steps to keep up at the reception. On the day of the wedding, as I watched Eric and Claire exchange vows under the oak tree, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was what life was about: love, resilience, and moving forward. Laura's betrayal had threatened to shatter me, but instead, it pushed me to rebuild, to find strength I didn't know I had. In the months that followed, I settled into my new role as part of Eric and Claire's household. I wasn't just a guest, I was part of the foundation, a link between the past and the future. I helped with projects around the house, shared stories from my own life, and even found new hobbies: gardening, woodworking, and spending time with my granddaughter when she arrived a year later. Claire once told me, "You're the heart of this family, Andrew. We wouldn't be here without you." Her words humbled me. I hadn't always felt strong or capable, but hearing her say that made me realize how far I'd come. I wasn't just rebuilding myself, I was building something new, something better. Occasionally, thoughts of Laura crept back into my mind, but they no longer held power over me. I'd heard through the grapevine that she was still struggling, hopping between jobs and places to live, her once perfect facade shattered. I didn't feel anger or pity, just indifference. She was a part of my past, and that's where she would stay. My life now was full of meaning, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. The scars Laura left behind were still there, but they no longer hurt. They were reminders of a storm I had weathered, proof that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way forward. As I stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set behind the oak tree, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. My parents' legacy lived on, not just in the rebuilt home or the land it stood on, but in the love and resilience of the family they had built. And for the first time in a long while, I was at peace.